we begin where all cautionary tales must, with the emptiness. There is a profound quiet that settles over fields and towns when the harvest fails, a stillness unlike any seasonal slumber. It is the silence of expectation betrayed, the hush before the panic. When life's most fundamental commodity, food, becomes scarce, history shows us a strange elasticity in the human spirit, an unnerving willingness to stretch definitions until they snap. We are not merely talking about hardship, though famine is undeniably a brutal force. We are discussing scarcity writ large, a creeping economic dread that begins subtly enough to be dismissed as bad luck and progresses relentlessly toward existential threat. Our investigation starts with the visible evidence of want. The granaries found half empty, the market stalls draped in dust sheets like forgotten promises, the once robust hum of civilization's exchange suddenly falters into an anxious murmur. To understand what happens when man turns to cannibalism, we must first appreciate how profoundly reliable abundance is. It is the cushion, the safety net, that maintains our deepest inhibitions, our empathy, our law, and indeed, our respect for boundaries. When that cushion vanishes, when the predictable flow of resources evaporates into thin air, what remains is the raw calculus of survival. This moment, this tipping point where civility gives way to sheer metabolic imperative, is where the true story begins. We see it in the pallor of faces gathering in dusty squares, eyes carrying a haunted weariness that no amount of charity could cure. The initial responses are always localized, quiet acts of desperate barter, a single pig, an ill-gotten grain scoop, but they build momentum. Desperation is not linear, it compounds. It begins with the polite suggestions of rationing, the careful measures. Soon, whispers replace pronouncements, and those whispers carry terrifying freight. We begin to look beyond simple starvation and into the psychological mechanisms that define humanity under duress. The body becomes an accounting ledger. What was once deemed unusable, the skeletal remains. The preserved waste suddenly gains a strange potential value. This is not merely about finding enough food for today. It's about determining who gets tomorrow. The intellectual veneer of culture and law begins to crack under this pressure. When people are forced into prolonged states of hunger, their entire ethical framework collapses, replaced by an urgent, primal logic that knows no virtue, religion, or historical period. The question we must ask ourselves is not simply whether cannibalism occurred. It is rather where the line between sheer animal necessity and formalized cultural behavior resides. Does desperation alone mandate atrocity? Or does the desperate environment actively suggest ritual? As the whispers grow louder and more insistent, they draw us from simple survival accounts into something far stranger, the idea that hunger, when pushed to its absolute limits, may transform not just men, but also memory itself. It becomes a collective forgetting of what it means to be civilized, leaving only the primal question hanging in the chilled air. What happens when survival crosses into sheer spectacle? It is at this threshold, this whispering whisper of want, that the true examination must begin. We leave the raw edges of pure necessity and step across a much more perplexing threshold. Our journey now pivots from survival driven by stomach pangs to sustenance dictated by deeply entrenched belief. If famine was merely an agonizing lack, then ritual consumption speaks to a complete excess, an overabundance of ideology that places sacred law above basic biology. Here, the human body itself ceases to be merely flesh and bone. It becomes sacred material, a canvas for piety, or perhaps a commodity in the grand economy of faith. This is where the investigation moves from the desperate camp to the hushed, candlelit chamber of tradition. To understand this strange confluence of appetite and altar, we must suspend our modern squeamishness and adopt the detached, almost clinical curiosity of an anthropologist studying a profound cultural eccentricity. For much of the pre-modern world, life and death were rarely seen as merely physical events. They were cosmological ones. A successful harvest wasn't just good luck. It was divine favor maintained through precise ritual adherence. And if the body, particularly in moments of spiritual extreme, be it martyrdom, sacrifice, or alleged divine intervention, was a vessel for that spirit, then its utilization became a profoundly complex matter. The consumption we are about to examine is often filtered through the lens of accusation and misunderstanding. Yet, within those accounts lie powerful echoes of how deeply intertwined the concepts of divinity, purity, and physical life could become. The historical records concerning these acts are notoriously contradictory, saturated with bias, rumor, and political propaganda. But filtering out the sensationalism, we find undeniable patterns. The ceremonial depiction of feasting, the ritual handling of remains, and the deep cultural significance attached to ingesting certain materials. These accounts force us into a strange space where the sacred act, the communion of wine and bread, blurs disconcertingly with the profane action of flesh eating. The concept is not simply consumption. It is incorporation. To consume something ritually means not just to remove its physical energy, but to absorb its essence, its virtue, or its power. The idea that a deity's favor could be contained within the sacrificial components, or even in the bodies of rivals whose spiritual energies needed to be neutralized, is mind-bending. It was an attempt to manage the terrifying ambiguity of existence by making the unseen tangible and therefore consumable. The human body became the ultimate reservoir for both power and perceived pollution. We find ourselves studying alleged feast narratives that blur the lines between therapeutic practice, political theater, and outright horror. These were rarely simple meals meant for pleasure. They were profound, highly coded performance pieces designed to reaffirm group identity, enforce hierarchy, or validate a spiritual claim in a hostile landscape. Imagine an entire community gathered not just for food, but for affirmation. Every bite, every shared piece of bread was laden with meaning, the weight of tradition, the promise of divine protection, or the brutal assertion of tribal superiority. These rituals often emerged at moments of intense cultural stress, not always starvation, but times when established belief systems were threatened by external enemies, invading cultures, or even internal schisms. The act of consuming something other than standard sustenance became a powerful form of cultural boundary setting. This is who we are. This is what gives us life. And the people deemed outside that circle, the enemy, the heretic, the uninitiated, became the material through which that boundaries were enforced. The accounts are fascinating in their disturbing academic quality. They require us to ask not did they eat them, but rather what was this act supposed to achieve within their complex belief structure. Was it a means of transferring immunity? Were specific parts believed to confer martial prowess or intellectual superiority? Did the ingestion itself cleanse the community from perceived spiritual contamination, much like purification rites of water? We must approach these narratives with extreme caution, treating them as anthropological hypotheses rather than factual dietary records. The medieval chronicler was rarely a neutral observer. He was often an agent of state, a religious zealot, or simply a deeply fearful participant attempting to make sense of chaos. Their goal in writing these accounts, whether exaggerating the details or leaving them vague, was frequently to justify the power dynamics that preceded the narrative itself. Consider the difference between necessity and dogma. Necessity is brutal but immediate. It requires little explanation beyond an empty stomach. Dogma, however, is complex, requiring a system of beliefs vast enough to justify treating human life as both sacred subject matter and expendable resource material. Ritual consumption suggests that for certain groups, belief was not merely part of life, it was the primary mechanic powering survival itself. It forces us to confront the terrifying elasticity of morality when stripped bare by profound spiritual conviction. The act moves from the physical desperation of Chapter 1, where one eats because one must live, to the cultural imperative of a rite, where one consumes because the god demands it or the law dictates it . In both scenarios, the humanity we recognize begins to fracture. The lines between self-preservation and spiritual obligation become dangerously indistinguishable. Therefore, When reviewing these alleged feasts, we are not just looking at meals, we are examining belief systems under maximum duress. We are tracing the fragile boundary where faith curdles into appetite, turning the altar into a banquet table, and sacramental communion into something far more visceral and disturbing. These were moments when civilization's safety net didn't simply dissolve. It was deliberately, ritually unstitched by the very fervor meant to sustain it. J. Songsharp, text. If ritual consumption, as we explored in our last discussion, was an act of ideological overreach, a desperate attempt to align life with belief, then what happens when ideology completely collapses under the relentless weight of sheer physical deprivation? The shift is profound. We move from the spiritual imperative to the stark mathematics of survival. The siege. It is history's most brutal and unforgiving reality show. Consider these massive, stone-walled enclosures not merely as military fortifications, but as perfect psychological crucibles. They are designed to concentrate desperate human lives into a single, vulnerable space, where the outer world, the supply lines, the fields, the supportive civilization, is ruthlessly cut off. The walls become a self-imposed coffin, sealed shut by circumstance and architecture. In these moments of extreme confinement, the sophisticated mechanisms of civil society begin to fail in spectacular fashion. The system was designed for war, but not for protracted, starved stalemate. When famine enters the equation of siege warfare, it does not simply thin out the population. It fundamentally destabilizes the moral operating system of the entire community. The initial phases of a prolonged siege are almost textbook. There is the initial shock, the frantic organization around rationing, the strict adherence to remaining supplies, the grain stores dwindling slowly, the discipline holding for weeks or even months. This period is marked by false hope. Hope, we find, is often more dangerous than the reality of starvation itself. But the siege cannot sustain its fiction forever. The reserves run low. The rations are cut. And with the visible depletion of resources comes a corresponding and equally terrifying erosion of human dignity and social structure. Morality ceases to be a communal agreement and becomes an utterly fleeting commodity, priced only by immediate physical need. The body itself transforms from being viewed as sacred or autonomous, as it might have been in the context of ritual feasting, into its most basic function, stored energy. The flesh loses its mystique and becomes merely biomass. It becomes a calculus problem to be solved on the spot, under the perpetual stress of enclosure. The historical record from sieges offers us some of our bleakest case studies, nowhere more intensely focused than perhaps the dramatic narratives surrounding Jerusalem during periods of extreme military pressure. These accounts are stained by propaganda and trauma, yes, but they point toward a repeatable, predictable descent. When starvation takes hold in such confined quarters, the hierarchy of survival is brutally simple. Those who consume survive, and consumption becomes functionally divorced from culture or law. We observe a critical pivot in the social dynamic. Initially, there are attempts to maintain order through rigid rules, quarantines, rationing committees, martial law. But as the malnutrition sets in, as the physical frailty reaches its nadir, these formal structures crumble like dried plaster. The psychological stress takes over. The initial crime of desperation is simple: theft, hoarding, fighting over the last handfuls of bread. This low-level struggle quickly escalates when we confront the true lack, the absence of viable nutritional intake for sustaining life itself. The failure to find sufficient sustenance pushes humanity to consider its own kind as an alternative resource pool. This is where the academic detachment must be applied with extreme care. When chroniclers wrote these accounts, they were not necessarily recording objective fact. They were documenting profound terror and sometimes outright hysteria amplified by the passage of time. But what do their descriptions confirm? They confirm a breakdown of boundaries. The barrier between self and other dissolves. The concept here is one of extreme environmental determinism. Man's civilized behavior, his adherence to ethics, his regard for law, his respect for neighboring life, is shown to be overwhelmingly conditional. It requires resources. It requires time, requires the buffer zone provided by a stable supply chain and the relative safety of open society. The siege provides that lethal combination: perfect containment combined with zero sustainability. The physical architecture becomes an amplifier of primal needs, turning a military objective into a profoundly anthropological nightmare. We are witnessing not just a failure of defenses, but a catastrophic failure of the human psyche under ultimate duress. Consider the sheer psychological burden placed upon every single individual trapped within those walls. Every glance across the crowded square is fraught with an underlying economic calculation. Who will survive? And what resources, human or otherwise, are necessary to balance that equation? The body, stripped of its role in labor, ritual performance, or social contribution by famine, becomes merely a reservoir, a problem waiting to be solved. The act, when it finally occurs under these extreme conditions, is thus terrifyingly pragmatic. It isn't always presented as the grand spectacle we might imagine. Often, within the context of starvation-fueled desperation, it was characterized by grim efficiency and heartbreaking utilitarianism. The lingering question that emerges from analyzing these historical flashpoints, the accounts etched into brittle parchment describing the fall out of walls, is how deeply rooted is our supposed ethical core. Are our laws simply elaborate, highly sophisticated agreements that require constant energetic maintenance to function? When the energy reserve reaches zero, are we truly capable of maintaining civilized behavior? The siege spotlight illuminates this dreadful vulnerability. It forces us into a position of disturbing intellectual contemplation. When faced with extinction by caloric deficiency, does humanity revert to an animal state, discarding every learned restraint in favor of raw, mechanical necessity? These accounts suggest not just that society is fragile, but that its foundation might be built upon sand, held together only by the illusion of infinite supply and eternal stability. This brutal confluence of man against environment sets the stage for analyzing all forms of extreme violence, whether it manifests as outright brutality in battle, or as a horrific transaction conducted within the walls themselves. If famine stripped away the comforts of civilization, it certainly cleared the field for something far more visceral. We have spent our previous chapters examining scarcity, the desperate hunger that shifts a mind from polite survival to pure instinct. But if desperation alone is merely an internal failing, then what about conflict? What happens when the need for sustenance meets the brutal chaos of battle? The battlefield, as history so often reminds us, was not just a location of combat. It was also a grim pantry. We must adjust our lens now, adopting a measure of black humor. We are going to look at these horrific accounts with the detached curiosity one might apply to analyzing poorly planned dinner party menus. Because in many ways, that is what battlefield butchery amounted to: the disastrous handling of perishable resources under immense pressure. Imagine the sheer organizational nightmare. An army advances into hostile territory, depleting its supplies daily. The goal is victory, but the immediate problem becomes sustaining enough bodies, both combatants and non-combatants, to live long enough to achieve it. And when provisions fail, human engineering quickly turns toward other biological materials. The medieval chroniclers, those meticulous recorders of both triumph and atrocity, documented these excesses with a chilling bureaucratic eye. They didn't just report mass death, they recorded the subsequent distribution, transforming desperate violence into grim supply chain management. The spoils were not merely gold or captured weaponry. Often, they were simply biomass. These narratives suggest that the battlefield was an ecological cul-de-sac where standard rules of civilized consumption collapsed entirely. If you cannot ration bread and salted meat, the body itself becomes the ultimate and most immediate resource cache. This was not a sudden lapse into madness. It often developed as a horrific, grim logic. Consider the nature of military campaigns. Sieges are already high-stakes scenarios, a controlled environment where resources dwindle until panic sets in. But when armies meet in open combat, the desperation is far more acute, and the timeline for resource depletion is tragically accelerated. The shock of sudden violence, followed by prolonged entrenchment and starvation, forces decisions that dismantle every moral boundary humanity typically erects. The accounts are often gruesome, detailing systematic methods of stripping resistance or capturing personnel purely for consumption. It wasn't merely scavenging. There was a troubling degree of organization implied in many sources, a grim, collective decision to turn the enemy into provisions. This suggests that when civil law breaks down under the pressures of war, social norms can be rapidly replaced by something far simpler and far more brutal: pure caloric necessity. The narrative shift here is profound. We move from theoretical anthropological case studies, the rituals seen in peacetime or extreme deprivation, to the reality of immediate military conflict. This adds a layer of raw, unscripted violence that makes previous consumption events seem almost stylized by comparison. Now, we must consider the motivation. Was it always simple starvation? Or was there an element of psychological dominance? For the medieval world, feeding on enemies wasn't just about calories. It was also a potent, terrifying performance of power. By consuming the opponent, one was symbolically destroying their very essence, incorporating their vitality into oneself or one's group. It was the ultimate declaration. You cease to exist, and your existence fuels my continued life. This blend of sheer physical need and psychological warfare is what makes these narratives so unsettlingly compelling when viewed through a modern academic lens. We are asked to treat acts that represent humanity's nadir with the same detachment we might use to categorize an ancient agricultural technique. It forces us to confront the uncomfortable line between survival instinct, political desperation, and outright ritualistic atrocity. The chronicles give us glimpses into this confluence of factors. The brutality detailed is overwhelming. It speaks not just to hunger, but to a profound systemic breakdown. When the threat is omnipresent, from famine in the streets to enemy blades on the field, the concept of restraint becomes practically meaningless. The rules governing civilized conduct simply evaporate, leaving behind only the harsh calculus of life versus death. The aftermath of such events, if survival permitted reporting, was often marked by a strange mixture of grim relief and deep cultural shock. These acts become etched into the collective memory, not just as warnings of brutality, but sometimes as dark cautionary tales that survived centuries of revisionism and censorship because they were too horrifying to ignore. And so we are left with these chilling dinner plans, woven from desperation, conflict, and the stark realization that the human body, divorced from its social context, is perceived not merely as self, but potentially as a shared commodity. The battlefield demands efficiency. The enemy offers resources. What lines do we draw when survival itself becomes the most intoxicating spectacle? These questions continue to hang in the air, heavier and darker than any war cry, challenging everything we understand about the limits of civilization. We have examined the deep troughs of desperation, tracing how the stomach can undermine civilization and how ritual compulsion can elevate scarcity into sacred spectacle. We have observed humanity at its most primal, reducing the body to mere fuel, a final, desperate calculus of caloric need. But where does the abyss end and the law begin? This next chapter pulls back from the visceral horror of the battlefield, lifting our gaze to the abstract framework of justice itself. For medieval man-eaters, their actions existed in a profound legal ambiguity. They were simultaneously survivalists, facing insurmountable odds, religious adherents following arcane mandates, and criminal perpetrators defying every known societal contract. Modern law struggles with these categorizations. How do you prosecute desperation? Is the act inherently evil simply because it violates taboo? Or does its origin mitigate the moral weight of the deed? This question forms the central legal crucible of our investigation. Are acts of cannibalism crimes in themselves, or are they merely tragic cultural expressions of a collapsed state? The medieval jurists and chroniclers struggled profoundly with this very paradox. Their legal frameworks, built upon concepts of property, personhood, and sacred law, offered no easy categorization for eating human flesh in extremis. The body was generally understood to be inviolable, sacrosanct, even in death. To consume it was an ultimate violation, a breach so profound that it defied simple classification as theft or assault. Sometimes, these acts were quickly condemned as monstrous heresy, proof of moral decay and spiritual damnation. Other times, they were treated with a degree of uncomfortable ethnographic detachment, suggesting that while illegal, the motivations behind them required understanding rather than just punishment. The concept of necessity played a massive role here. In civil law tradition, there existed precedents for necessity or duress, arguing that an act violating conventional law could be excused if the alternative was immediate death or profound harm. Applying this principle to cannibalism is dizzying. It pushes the boundaries of what we consider an acceptable crisis. A modern court might accept the argument that starvation necessitates eating grass or consuming raw, spoiled materials. But when does the threshold for desperation cross into something fundamentally different? Is killing another human being, even in dire need, still considered primary criminality? Regardless of the motive, the cultural element adds layers of complexity that legal codes simply could not parse. If one viewed certain instances through an anthropological lens as ritualistic feasting or group bonding rites, the act shifted from a purely criminal violation to a form of deeply encoded, albeit horrifying, culture. These acts were, in the eyes of their practitioners, governed by rules and meanings far removed from the rational concepts of jurisprudence. They became systems of meaning, survival through spectacle. The legal response was therefore bifurcated, operating on two distinct levels: the official statute book versus the prevailing societal understanding. Officially, any unprovoked consumption of human flesh would draw the most severe condemnation. Treason, heresy, and murder were the standard charges. But in practice, especially when detailing events like sieges or mass famine, the law often bent toward a sort of conditional acquittal, fueled by political expediency or sheer overwhelming scale of suffering. The narrative told to placate the powerful was rarely the raw, bloody truth. Take the vivid reports from times of prolonged siege. Here, the legal line didn't just blur, it dissolved entirely into the grit and grime of desperation. Survival became its own law, a brutal, immediate code administered outside the reach of ecclesiastical courts or imperial decrees. Property rights ceased to matter when one's immediate physical existence was threatened. Personhood evaporated, bodies became resources. These accounts suggest that for many medieval societies, especially those grappling with unprecedented scale of catastrophe, be it war, famine, or plague, the law was viewed not as an infallible structure, but as a flexible scaffold easily bent by the sheer weight of suffering. The legal line thus ceased to be a definitive boundary and became instead a fluid descriptor of where society could temporarily afford to look away. In some cases, the cultural element provided a shield. If the alleged cannibalism was framed within an existing ritual, a supposed communion with ancestors, or an emulation of sacred power derived from consumption, the legal blowback might be mitigated by sheer religious fervor. Here, the crime could become less about the flesh consumed and more about the belief system that mandated its use. This complex relationship between law and atrocity reveals a deep societal vulnerability, the human need for explanation. When faced with something utterly non-rational, the desperate act of eating one's neighbor, humanity tends to categorize it. Is it madness? Is it divine punishment? Is it resource management? The legal system, inherently rational and ordered, struggled mightily against these deeply irrational, life or death occurrences. The true lesson derived from studying the medieval attempt to legally categorize cannibalism is that law is not an immutable constant. It is a reflection of prevailing moral comfort. When civilization's foundations, food security, social order, and predictable governance crumble, the legal scaffolding inevitably collapses with them. What remains are raw, immediate actions governed by impulse and biological mandate. They teach us that crime is often merely a label applied posthumously by those who survived the worst. It requires an audience capable of judgment. In moments when only breath matters, accountability becomes the ultimate luxury, a commodity unavailable until much later. Thus, the legal line we examine here is not just about criminal statutes. It's about the fragile point where human morality breaks down under the exquisite pressure of utter want. These acts challenge our definition of self-preservation and expose the chilling truth that in the face of oblivion, man's deepest taboos are often the first to become simply optional. Having tracked the desperation from granaries to battlefields, we arrive now at the most crucial stage of our investigation, separating verifiable history from sensational folklore. This chapter is an exercise in scholarly skepticism, a necessary pause before we delve into the darkest chapters of human action. We are confronting not just the accounts of cannibalism itself, but the reliability of those who wrote them down, chroniclers and zealots, whose pens turned alleged atrocity into documented fact. History, it appears, is often written not by observers, but by survivors who were desperately trying to justify their own trauma. The medieval account of man-eaters is an overwhelming torrent of hyperbole. We must treat every bloody legend with the caution reserved for rumor whispered in a smoky tavern, a story that could be as terrifyingly true as it is entirely fabricated exaggeration. Many of these gripping tales were not eyewitness reports, but pieces of propaganda designed to define another, an enemy worthy of suspicion and ultimate condemnation. The narrative function of alleged cannibalism was often far more powerful than the literal act itself. Consider the way that any perceived deviation from established cultural norms, be it political dissent, religious heresy, or mere ethnic difference, could be instantly elevated to the realm of primal horror. Accusations of consuming flesh were not simply reports of violence. They functioned as ultimate societal branding irons, marking a group as fundamentally unclean, spiritually corrupt, and therefore deserving of utter extermination. The challenge for us is immense. How do we determine when fear becomes fact? How much of what survives in the meticulously preserved parchments, the vivid descriptions, the visceral details of consumption is evidence, and how much is merely literary embellishment designed to whip up moral outrage? The sheer power of narrative demands that these darkest events must have a dramatic climax. A simple skirmish or famine does not make for an epic chronicle. Only utter savagery will suffice. The historical record is riddled with such gaps. There are entire periods and populations whose lives were simply omitted, replaced instead by carefully crafted rumors designed to maintain rigid social boundaries. When the story of a people was one of threat, their deepest moral failings, the hypothetical consumption of kin or foe, were invariably invented and woven into the tapestry of conflict. Therefore, we must approach these alleged feats with an anthropologist's detachment. We are not here to condemn souls. We are merely analyzing patterns of fear. If every time a culture was threatened by external forces, cannibalism instantly entered their repertoire of potential sins. Perhaps the sin lay not with the victim, but with the very structure of human storytelling itself. The gap between myth and actual mastication is often bridged by sheer narrative need. A writer, needing to justify extreme violence or condemn a foe completely, found in the suggestion of ritual consumption the perfect tool. It was an absolute moral condemnation that transcended mere military defeat. To suggest cannibalism meant to strip away all pretense of civilized humanity. This skepticism is not intended to diminish genuine suffering. We acknowledge the reality of extreme hunger and the terror faced by populations under siege, forces which certainly pushed people toward unimaginable actions. But we must maintain critical distance from the narratives themselves. The truth often lies in the uncomfortable space between what was written and what could possibly have happened. We are left with a vast collection of highly charged claims, reports of alleged feasts in besieged cities, rumors of rites performed under extreme duress, sensationalized accounts circulated by victorious armies seeking to dehumanize their defeated foes. Many of these instances remain floating in the ether of alleged or reported, perpetually oscillating between historical case study and dramatic fiction. The real story, perhaps, is not what was eaten, but what the act of reporting that consumption revealed about the reporters themselves. It speaks to their anxieties, their political needs, and their deepest, most paranoid assumptions about humanity's capacity for savagery. The chronicles become a psychological portrait of civilization under strain rather than a literal menu of human dietary habits. When the evidence is overwhelmingly biased, whether by victor or victim, the only scholarly recourse is to question the source itself. And so we pause here, suspending judgment on the ultimate reality of these visceral accounts. We carry forward the knowledge that any narrative claiming cannibalism must be viewed through multiple critical lenses. Was it famine-driven desperation? Was it ideological dogma? Or was it simply the most effective piece of propaganda ever invented for controlling the moral imaginations of an entire society? The evidence is fascinating, unnervingly so. It suggests a shared, deeply human pattern that when life becomes dangerously scarce, morality itself is often the first resource to run out. We have spent our journey examining the desperate arithmetic of survival, how famine depletes resources, how siege warfare degrades morale, and how cultural ritual can blur the line between faith and visceral need. We've looked at the body not merely as a vessel for consciousness, but potentially as raw biomass, a calculable unit in an equation of zero sum. But there is a deeper layer to this subject, one that moves beyond mere caloric desperation. It concerns power. The ultimate act of consumption was never simply about avoiding death. Sometimes it was about making a statement. It was the most absolute, irreversible declaration of dominance. The questions we've raised thus far were: when do ethical boundaries dissolve? And what role does necessity play in these horrific historical accounts? Now, we must ask a final, chilling question concerning hierarchy itself. In a society reduced to its core resources, whose body holds the most value, who is considered expendable, and who possesses the intrinsic right to remain at the head of the dinner table? To analyze cannibalism as purely survival mechanism overlooks its socio-political function. When the pantry empties, the social contract breaks down completely. What replaces it is a brutal, often immediate restructuring of value. Suddenly, worth is not measured by lineage, skill, or piety. It is measured by proximity to the means of power. The strongest, the most ruthless, and those who can project an aura of untouchable superiority gain immense leverage. The ultimate dinner seating arrangement was therefore never democratic. It was always dictated by a terrifying, hierarchical calculus of status. And this dynamic leads us deep into the political heart of these narratives, those moments when consumption becomes a brutal projection of power dynamics. Cannibalism shifts from an act of desperate feeding to an apex performance of controlled violence. The stories we encounter often frame the conflict as simply man against starvation, treating every victim with equal measure of tragic necessity. But historical records, even those colored by fear and zealotry, suggest a more complex, acutely political theater. The struggle for who eats first became a vivid enactment of existing power struggles, those deemed less valuable within the established social order, the conquered foe, the captured enemy, whose lineage was considered insignificant, or perhaps even rival factions within the besieging group itself were often the primary targets. Their removal served multiple purposes. It provided necessary calories, yes, but more critically, it satisfied a profound psychological need for assertion. The spectacle of consumption became a perverse form of political theater by defining who was consumed and by establishing an ultimate boundary between us and them. The groups involved were not just securing survival. They were reinforcing their own internal cohesion through shared transgression. The ritualized consumption of the enemy body served as the most brutal kind of group bonding, a gruesome pact signed in blood and bone. Consider the detailed accounts emanating from siege warfare narratives. When a city walls fails, the last remaining vestiges of law dissolve instantly. But even in that void, patterns emerge. The initial focus is not random scavenging. It tends to follow established lines of conflict and status. Those viewed as threats, or those who represent an opposing worldview, are literally metabolized out of existence. This suggests that the act, however brutal its necessity, maintains a perverse adherence to social logic, a morbid reflection of the community's deepest anxieties about order and subordination. The question then becomes, did the potential for cannibalism exist solely as a last resort measure, or was it an inherent feature in the extreme breakdown of civilized life? The answer may be that survival simply exposed pre-existing fault lines. The group wasn't merely desperate for food, it was fundamentally desperate to reassert its internal order and its external supremacy. The very act confirmed who held the ultimate veto power over another human life. The dinner table, in these moments of extreme crisis, becomes a mirror reflecting society's deepest prejudices about worthiness. Those considered weak, or those outside the group's moral parameters, become literal resources. This is not merely survival. This is the brutal institutionalization of prejudice through necessity. It suggests that when the core pillars of civilization, law, morality, and shared belief, are removed by starvation, all that remains are the most primal and rigid social hierarchies, reinforced by blood. This cynical understanding of human nature under duress challenges us to look past sensationalist reports. We must view these accounts not just as gastronomic disasters, but as deep anthropological studies in power exchange. The body is only valuable insofar as it confirms the group's perceived superiority and stability. Who eats first reveals who currently holds the most undisputed authority. It was less about filling stomachs than it was about satisfying the visceral need to dominate another's fate. The chilling takeaway from these narratives is that necessity does not eliminate social structures. It merely strips them bare, revealing the raw mechanisms of control underneath. The greatest threat in times of famine and siege may not be the lack of bread or water, but the sudden and horrifying realization of who you are truly willing to sacrifice, and who has the undisputed right to claim them first. We have spent time examining the desperate calculus of pure need, looking at how famine stripped away mere civility, reducing the body to nothing more than a metabolic equation. But sometimes, when desperation reaches its extreme peak, those calculations cease to be purely biological. They intersect with belief. Belief is perhaps one of humanity's most persistent and baffling drives. It is what allows us to rationalize the irrational, to bestow sacred meaning upon otherwise brutal chaos. And in the dark crucible of medieval thought, the line between pure necessity, political spectacle, and genuine religious fervor was impossibly thin. As we turn our attention toward witchcraft and belief, we are forced into a deeply unsettling corner of human history. Here, consumption is rarely about simple caloric depletion. It is often framed as an exchange, a ritualistic transaction involving power, purity, or the very essence of the soul itself. The body does not merely sustain life. Under these interpretations, it becomes a repository of magic, a vessel capable of being emptied, filled, or traded for arcane advantage. Consider the prevailing belief systems that shrouded the era. Magic and medicine were often inextricably linked, and those who practiced these arts, particularly alleged witches, were viewed with a terrifying mix of terror and misplaced awe. Their knowledge, their perceived access to forbidden power, made them both villains in the eyes of the state and fascinating subjects for anthropological study. The body, therefore, was not just flesh. It was an antenna, a circuit board susceptible to malevolent interference. When we view the narratives surrounding alleged cannibalism through this lens of magical thinking, the true horror becomes layered. It is no longer simply man ate man. It is transformed into accusations of pacts, transfers of forbidden knowledge, or attempts at sympathetic magic. To consume a specific body part, the liver for its presumed vitality, or perhaps parts associated with sexual essence, was not merely gluttony. It was an attempted ritualistic appropriation of power that could supposedly grant the consumer immunity, intelligence, or supernatural might. The medieval understanding of illness and malady further complicates this picture. Many afflictions were not understood as biological events, but as spiritual attacks, curses cast by the malevolent forces believed to be channeled through witches. And when a group faced widespread illness, plague, or crippling famine, the natural inclination was to locate an external source, a perceived enemy force. This process of projecting blame onto outsiders, particularly those associated with forbidden knowledge, creates a fertile ground for spectacular atrocity. This synergy between extreme need and deep-seated religious paranoia is where the narratives become most academically perplexing. We are left analyzing texts that describe acts bordering on body horror, not just visceral consumption, but ideological incorporation. Was this evidence of genuine survival desperation? Or was it an overblown manifestation of theological fear? The chroniclers, whether recording true events or merely amplifying local rumors for dramatic effect, were keenly interested in demonstrating the fragility of divine order when men strayed too far from accepted doctrine. The resulting narratives are saturated with accusations that neighboring communities practiced these abhorrent rites, accusations that internal groups sought illicit power through forbidden means. These stories served a dual purpose. On one hand, they reinforced community boundaries, delineating who was sacred and worthy of life, and who was ritually impure. On the other hand, they provided sensationalized cautionary tales, reinforcing the authority of both church doctrine and established legal order. The cannibalistic act, framed as magical consumption, thus becomes a powerful narrative tool used to maintain social control. It is through this deeply embedded belief system that we must reevaluate our earlier findings on resource depletion. While famine created physical scarcity, witchcraft narratives added an ontological scarcity, a fear of the soul's purity being consumed or stolen. The body became valuable not just for its calories, but for its magical integrity. To consume, it was to attempt theft on a spiritual level. The investigation, therefore, shifts from merely asking what men would do when they starved to asking, what did society fear most deeply about losing? Was it food, power, purity? In the medieval mind, all three were intrinsically linked, bound together by rumor, ritual, and the dark necessity of survival. The tales that survive, the alleged flesh feasts connected to witch trials or heretical practices, are thus less an objective record of consumption and more a profound map of deeply held anxieties regarding humanity's place between divine blessing and absolute entropy. They are magnificent examples of how fear itself can become the most potent fuel for both atrocity and belief. The memory of extreme scarcity does not simply dissipate when the granaries are restocked and the fields flourish again. It leaves behind something far more insidious, something etched not into the soil, but into the deepest strata of communal memory, a collective scar tissue woven through the fabric of recorded history. The trauma is complex, not merely a simple tale of brutality to be forgotten, but a complicated, lingering shadow that dictates how future societies categorize and ritualize their own breaking points. Consider the chronicles themselves. The grand literary attempts to make sense of utter desolation. These surviving accounts are saturated with awe, horror, moralizing judgment, and sometimes, bafflingly, even dark irony. They are the archaeological record of a societal collapse. They tell us less about the actual events, for those details remain buried under layers of fear and myth, and more about the observer's desperate attempts to impose meaning on chaos. Every tale of desperation, whether involving ritual consumption or sheer survival butchery, is filtered through the biases of the survivor chronicler. This means that what we inherit are not objective facts, but sophisticated narrative structures designed for emotional release. When humanity reaches a point where the body itself becomes the final commodity, a mere reservoir of caloric energy, the ensuing accounts do not merely record an action, they perform a moral judgment upon those who survive it. The scars left behind are twofold: the physical reminders, such as decimated settlements or barren battlefields, and the ideological wounds that challenge the core tenets of law, religion, and civilized identity. These forgotten accounts, often dismissed by modern sensibilities as mere sensationalism or the exaggerated hysteria of zealots, carry profound weight. They speak to a fundamental human need. When our social structures crumble into dust, we must construct new, immediate narratives to prevent absolute psychological disintegration. The story becomes the substitute for order. By defining who survived and how they utilized those boundaries, ancient communities were not just recording an atrocity, they were conducting a brutal desperate act of self-definition. They were saying, this is what happens when all external law fails. This is our darkest capacity. The long-term consequence of these desperate episodes was the solidification of potent cultural myths. The vivid descriptions of famine feasts, for instance, became cautionary folklore, stories that did not just warn against hunger, but warned against forgetting the absolute fragility of moral restraint itself. They codified the boundary between necessity and taboo with a degree of permanence rarely seen in human history. And so we arrive at a profoundly unsettling understanding. These acts, whether driven by theological compulsion or pure gnawing need, become historical fixtures, mythic touchstones that inform subsequent artistic representations, religious dogma, and even jurisprudence. They represent society's struggle to write itself back into existence after the page has been ripped out by starvation. The spectacle of ultimate depravity, in effect, became a perverse cultural mirror, forcing succeeding generations to constantly confront the possibility of their own undoing. Yet, this lingering shadow presents us with an even more delicate intellectual puzzle. How do we responsibly treat these records? We must resist the easy urge toward sensationalism or absolute condemnation. Instead, we must adopt the stance of highly meticulous anthropologists, observing not just the asterisk act asterisk described, but the asterisk system asterisk that generated the description. Why did this story survive? Whose voice elevated it to legend? Was the initial act an unavoidable response to systemic failure, or was its narrative function always designed from the outset to exert social control, to define enemy status, or to reinforce internal group purity? The forgotten accounts are thus less about blood and teeth than they are about cultural anxiety. They are whispers detailing the moments when the foundational premises of civilization, of property, of divine law, of the sanctity of the body, were exposed as utterly provisional. They prove that morality is not a fixed bedrock beneath our feet, but rather a delicate, high-tension membrane stretched over the abyss, capable of tearing under sustained duress. The cumulative effect of these catastrophic moments was to give medieval society a deep, enduring vocabulary for disaster itself, a lexicon built on dread, desperate survival, and the unsettling performance of human limitation. This leaves us suspended in that profoundly uncomfortable space between documented truth and cultural embellishment. It asks us to look past the graphic horror and instead focus upon the quiet, persistent echoes, the societal scars, the need for a compelling narrative climax, and the enduring mystery of how far, precisely, the human spirit, when pressed by hunger or panic, is capable of traveling. The answer, writ large across centuries of desperate chronicles, remains deeply unsettling, beautifully terrifying, and eternally unforgettable. We have traveled through the desperate logistics of survival, from the tight confines of sieges to the high drama of battlefield collapse. We looked at hunger as a physical force and power as a political dynamic. But what we have really been exploring is something far more unsettling: the sheer elasticity of the human spirit itself, the ability to pivot between profound acts of saintliness and bewildering, consuming depravity. It's a contradiction so vast it defies simple moral categorization. We stand now at the edge of understanding, in the delicious abyss where civilization dissolves into mere instinct. Imagine that space, the moment when all rules, legal, ethical, sacred, are suspended by an overwhelming biological imperative. There is no civilized response left to default to, only a raw negotiation with reality. Our historical accounts, painted with such dramatic fervor and steeped in moral panic, rarely allow us the luxury of nuance. They prefer the clean, shocking clarity of absolute breakdown. Man eats man, civilization ends. But perhaps that simplicity is precisely the lie. Perhaps the most enduring mystery isn't what humanity did, but simply how close it came to breaking entirely. Consider this final contemplation less as a conclusion and more as an invitation into the dream state, a place where waking reality's stringent moral codes lose their grip on our narrative. We are forced to admit that deep within us, capable of creating complex societies, laws, and art, there exists an animalistic core, barely contained, whispering promises of ultimate resource utilization. What emerges from these studies is not a simple consensus. Cannibalism was either universally necessary, culturally mandated, or entirely fabricated by fearful chroniclers. Instead, it appears to be a deeply complex symptom, a dramatic flare-up revealing deep fissures in the social contract itself. It speaks less about what people ate and more about what they were willing to betray, abandon, or violate in the name of persistence. The lines drawn between man and beast are not fixed geographical boundaries. They are flexible moral ones. They warp under duress, bending like stressed metal, revealing underlying structural weaknesses we might take for granted when times are calm. We build our laws and our myths around these assumed stability points. But history has taught us that true testing happens in the moment of absolute zero, the point where grain reserves vanish, where the walls fall, or where the fever grips the community. If we treat civilization as a magnificent but fragile edifice, then survival under duress is nothing less than an earthquake hitting its foundation. It doesn't just expose weaknesses, it can cause catastrophic collapse. And when that collapse occurs, the resulting behavior, the sheer spectacle of desperation, becomes both horrifying and utterly compelling to observe, if only from a detached academic distance. We are left, therefore, not with definitive answers, but with endless questions questions about the nature of need. Is hunger purely biological, or does it carry an ideological charge? Questions about morality. Is decency truly innate, or merely a highly practiced social performance that requires constant maintenance? And most fundamentally, we must ask ourselves, what are our own thresholds? The human story is defined by these profound contradictions. We are narrative creatures. We need stories of triumph and terror to define who we are. But when the ultimate horror becomes the only available story, the reality television event played out on a besieged wall, our moral imagination, our sacred concepts of dignity become mere commodities, consumed alongside everything else. This leaves us with an almost terrifying thought. Perhaps the true record of humanity is not written in chronicles detailing feasts or laws, but rather etched into the collective memory of these extreme moments. These stories survive because they are so dramatically charged. They operate on a level of primal spectacle that captures our deepest fears and most taboo curiosities. The descent into this delicious abyss shows us that beneath the polished veneer of modern ethical sensibilities lies an ancient, persistent question. When faced with oblivion, what is the absolute limit? What corner of human existence remains untouchable by desperation, by fear, or by the terrible lure of spectacle itself? The answer remains whispered in the dark recesses of history, a chilling reminder that survival sometimes